All right, let's get started. Thank you everybody for being here today for our webinar. This webinar is presented by Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman in collaboration with the Behaviorally Informed Organizations Partnership. Although we're meeting virtually, we do want to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So my name is Kristen Duke, and I am an assistant professor of marketing at Rotman and a research fellow at BIOrg, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. We're delighted to have Lynn Fei, who's a PhD candidate at UChicago's Booth School of Business, and Dan Bartels, who's a professor in marketing at Booth. Before I introduce them, I just want to give you a little bit of context for the ground rules for this webinar. After the introductions, we're going to have our speakers deliver a 30 to 40-minute presentation of their work. During the presentation, feel free to submit your questions by clicking that Q&A tab at the top or bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can type it into the entry box. So at the end of their talk, and given time permitting, we'll have a question and answer session, and I'll select questions from that Q&A to ask our speakers. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Lynn and Dan. So Lynn Fei is a PhD candidate at the UChicago Booth School of Business. Her research focuses on understanding the representation of consumers' behaviors like budgeting and the adoption of technology. And Dan Bartels is a professor in marketing at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and his research investigates the mental representations and processes underlying consumer financial decision-making, moral psychology, and intertemporal choice. So thank you both so much for being here today. We're very excited to hear what you have to show us, and feel free to take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, Kristen. And let me attempt to share my screen. Is that working? Okay, perfect. All right. Thank you for the introduction again. I guess I don't have to talk about myself anymore, which is great. Very happy to be here today and sharing this research on mental representation and spending and saving decisions. Now, this is joint work with my advisor, Dan Bartels, who will be joining us more in the Q&A sessions, and I'll mostly do the talking before then. So what we'll be focusing on today is the question of what do people do when they deviate from their budget. So to start with, I'd like to lay out a definition of what budgets are. So a budget is a certain amount of resources, which is very often money, allocated to some specific functional categories so that one can keep track of spending and restrict spending in some certain categories. As an example, people might have a budget for the next vacation or the next grocery trip so that they don't end up spending too much on either of these things. And now we're concerned with studying budgets because, first of all, budgets are relevant to a lot of people and their financial well-being. So according to this recent excellent survey by Yiwei Zhang and her colleagues, 80% of people report having budgeted at some point, and the practice of budgeting is positively correlated with people's financial well-being. And now keeping a budget is great and has lots of advantages, but people often encounter situations where they have to deviate from their budgets. So oftentimes things do not go as planned. You know, inflation now is skyrocketing, and we might easily find ourselves in a situation where, you know, groceries that we often buy cost us more than expected. And obviously there are many ways to deal with deviation from budgets. So one can update their budget or look for additional income sources. But from our own pilot surveys, around 90% of people mention that they would essentially cut some spending on other items to kind of stick to their budgets. So we'll be focusing on where people might cut their spending once they experience deviation from budgets. Now, this is an important question for not only consumers, but marketers as well, because marketers would want to know, for example, what are the types of items people might cut back when they just went through some holiday splurge on gifts. Or more generally, they would want to know about the cross-price elasticity of their products. So when they increase their price or give out a price discount on the product, would people end up spending more of their budget on this product or products related to this brand? Or will they cut back on some of the products that they would also want to sell? Relatedly, marketers would also want to know what the products that could be kind of bundled together. So if people just spent on something, what else would they want to get kind of presumably for a decreased price? So marketers can design discounted product bundles. We will try to keep all of these questions in mind throughout our investigation, and with the focus on how people make spending and saving decisions after budgeting deviations. Now, there's some existing research that generates this sort of prediction. And one that addresses this most directly is from Heath and Saul in 1996. And this assumes that people have some budgeting categories in their mind, like food and clothing. And then once they spend on some item in the category, they post the spending to the category and adjust their spending based on the categorical boundary. So for example, when they just spent more on wine, they tend to decrease spending on pizza, which is in the same category of food, than shirts or jeans, which are of different categories. Now, we think that the current theorization are kind of limited in the way that predicts how consumers adjust their spending on a wider range of items. There are more expenditures than just food and clothing after all, right? So there are household products, there's transportation expenditures, there are expenditures associated with going out and having fun, and also debts and travel. And obviously, this is just an example, and a consumer might have different representation of what the budgeting categories are. But the question here we want to highlight is that when a consumer just spent on food, will she adjust on all the categories similarly or equally, or would she adjust more on some categories than others? Now, we want to propose a framework that allows us to think about all of these categories when a consumer makes spending adjustments. And the idea goes as the following. So we highlight the fact that people's categorization is grounded in their representation of concepts. And so we propose that people represent expenditures in a hierarchical taxonomy, which means they mentally organize their spending and categories into multiple nested levels. So take household products, food, and clothing as example. People might readily categorize household products and food together in the larger category of grocery store purchases before they join this large category with the clothing category to be something of an even larger category, such as retail purchases. And likewise, people might even think about food, which is in of itself a pretty big category, in smaller categories. So for example, consumers may categorize pizza and ice cream together in the frozen food category because this is how they're organized in grocery stores. And they might think about wine and cheese as gourmet foods. Now, one thing I'd like to note here again is that what you're seeing here is just an example, and I'm not making claims on how people are actually having these categories in their mind. All we're highlighting here is that there is this nested structure of categories. And we propose that people have this hierarchical structure in their minds because much evidence in the category and concepts literature has suggested that people think about natural categories in this way. So people might think about pine trees first as an evergreen and then as a tree or a plant. So to the extent that budgets are also categories, consumers might represent them in this way as well. And in this case, we also propose that consumer spending and savings decisions can be predicted by the taxonomic distance between items. Now, the taxonomic distance between two items is the lowest level at which two items are grouped together. So for example, pizza and ice cream are categorized together at the lowest level. And so they would have the shortest distance, a distance of 1. And then going up the hierarchy, pizza and wine would have different lower level groups, and they have to meet 2 levels up at the food category before they're categorized together. So they have a distance of 2. And then similarly, pizza and shampoo meet 3 levels up, and they would have a distance of 3. And pizza and jeans would have a distance of 4. And also, one item, obviously, with itself would have a distance of 0. So when you just spent on an item, you would be most likely to adjust on this item itself. And so, as I just kind of alluded to, this conceptualization of taxonomic distance gives us testable hypothesis on budgeting behavior, which is that when you just spent on an item, you'll be more likely to adjust your spending on items that are closer in representation than further. So when you just spent on pizza, the first thing that you might think about is that, okay, if this pizza is super expensive, I'm gonna cut pizza for the rest of the week or the rest of the month. But if you just spend on some expensive pizza, you might also be most likely to adjust on ice cream because they share a distance of 1. And a little less likely to adjust on wine, which has a distance of 2, and and even a little less for shampoo, and maybe there's no adjustment for shirts and jeans. So I mentioned this a couple times now, but I just want to highlight here again that we're using these categories as an example. So I'm just putting parentheses on all of these categorical labels. We need to kind of recover what the types of categories that people construct. And all we're saying here is that there is, or we propose that there is a hierarchical structure in the way that people organize spendings and budgets. So in this talk, I will talk about 3 studies, or 3 sets of studies more likely. The first study will detail how essentially we recover and elicit this hierarchy from our participants. And the second study, or the second set of study, will talk about the effect of this representation on self-reported spending adjustments. And there's a few variations that on the study that I'll quickly mention. And lastly, I will talk about a study that measures the effect of taxonomic distance and hierarchy on actual consumers' grocery purchase data. So in the first study, I will do what we said before, which is that we will not assume any categories, and we will recover the taxonomy from our participants. Now, because we do not know what categories people might construct, so instead of posing categorical labels like previous research did, we take a bottom-up approach named the successive pile sort, which is a method developed in cognitive science to characterize people's representation through grouping, merging, and splitting. So what people do is that they will look at a list of items. In our case, it's 64 items, and they will perform the successive pile sort. And to show you what this task is, this is the interface that our participants saw. So there were 64 expenditure items on the left, shown in these little index cards, and then you can drag and drop them into the categories on the right, into however many categories that you feel natural, and you can obviously add or delete more of the categories. And with these categories, we have the initial level of sorting as on the bottom right, there's this example of constructing initial group 1 and initial group 2. And now with this initial group of sorting, we proceed to the next stage, which is merging. So then after you constructed your initial categories, all of those categories will now appear on the left in blocks. And what you'll do in the merging stage is putting the blocks of categories together into larger categories. So participants would need to put together categories that seem most similar to each other and form this larger category. And they had to at least merge 2 categories and form the higher level of categories. And finally, you would have to split the initial categories and form the lower level categories. So what's happening now is that this little video is not starting at the right place, but what's happening now is that every item in an initial category is now shown on the left, and participants would have to sort them into different categories to form the lower level categories, and participants would have to repeat for every single initial level category that they constructed. So with these sorting, we then have the pairwise distance of all 64 items, depending on which level the items are categorized together. So if 2 items are in the lower level, they share distance of 1. If 2 items are not in the lower level, but in the initial category, they share distance of 2, and then so on and so forth. And as an example, an individual's distance would look like this. So all the 64 items would on the first row and column, and their distance would be in the middle, and all the diagonals are zeros because it's an item's distance with itself. And so in this example, right, for gas and rent, this person thinks that, you know, the gas and rent are very similar to each other, but rent and gym membership are not. And now with these individual distance matrices, we can do a lot of things to kind of recover the hierarchical structure. So for example, we can aggregate across all of our participants and apply hierarchical clustering and obtain a dendrogram like this. So this is how, on average, our participants in this exploratory study represent our 64 items. And the lower 2 items are grouped together, the closer in representation they are. So we can see that items grouped at the bottom have like what is commonly believed to be substitutes, as soap and shampoo, if you can see my little pointer. There are also things that are kind of complementary in nature, which are like breads and meats. They're all grouped at a very low level. And this practice also generates some natural blocks of groupings, as exemplified by the color code here. So there could be a block that revolves around the theme of kind of like going out and having fun and entertainment. There's also like a smaller block of clothing items. And these are kind of confirming in a way because they're similar to what previous researchers have used as predefined categories. But what we do here is we don't assume that, and we take a bottom-up approach to recover these. And 2 more things to note here is that first, we ran also a 2-wave study across 3 months to look at how stable people's representations are. And we found that people do build similar hierarchies even after 3 months, which suggests that there's retest reliability on the hierarchy and the taxonomy that they construct, and their representations are somewhat stable. And there's also statistical consensus across participants. And this means that participants mostly share the understanding that, you know, soap and shampoo are close in the taxonomy and closer than like soap and movies. And I will spare the details of how this is calculated, but it's a very nice property because it allows us to aggregate the taxonomy and say with confidence that this aggregate taxonomy actually applies to the majority of the population. But this practice so far is somewhat qualitative, and it's just describing the relationship between common expenditures. And we haven't really used it to generate any predictions. So this is what we're going to do next. Now, we hypothesized that people's spending adjustment can be predicted by their taxonomic distance. So when people deviate from budget after spending on some item, we think that they would be more likely to adjust items that are closer in the taxonomy or grouped at the lower level in this hierarchy than items that are grouped at higher levels of the hierarchy. So this is what our second set of study tries to test. And the first study I want to mention here is another two-wave study. And in the first wave, participants grouped a range of expenditures into the taxonomy, just like they did in study 1. And this gives us their own taxonomic distance between items. And in the second wave, which is 2 days after the first wave, they were invited back to make some spending adjustment on a variety of items. And in the second wave, all the stimuli, all the items were customized for every single person's taxonomy. So to make it more concrete, this is what our participants saw in the second wave as their spending adjustment task. So they read that, now imagine this is the beginning of the month. You went out with friends and planned to spend $50 on dining out. So this is the focal item that they're looking at. However, they ended up spending $67. So this is an overspending scenario. Each person also read about an underspending scenario. Now, in light of the event above, how much will you adjust your spending this month on each of the following items? And they would rate their spending adjustment on 4 comparison items. Now, these 4 comparison items have 1 at each level of each person's taxonomy. So these 4 items are completely customized for every participant. And I want to note here that, again, we did not prompt participants to sort expenditures in any certain way. So when they adjust their spending, they're only looking at the expenditure themselves and did not see any categorical labels. So these adjustment is free of the categorical restrictions. And moving on to the results. So let me first explain the y-axis. So it's about spending adjustment. So no adjustment is in the middle, is indicated by the horizontal bar at 0. And negative values mean that people would decrease spending on items, and positive values mean that they increase spending. So according to our hypothesis, we expected to see that the magnitude of adjustment would decrease as distance increases. So what it means is that if people want to cut their spending after they overspent on the focal item, they would cut the most from the closest item. And this means that in the overspending condition, all the bars should be negative because people are trying to decrease their spending on other items, but they would have an upward sloping trend as distance increases. Now, in the underspending condition, we would expect the opposite pattern. So the bars should be positive and sloping downward as distance gets larger. However, we've seen in past studies and surveys that people have a hard time reporting, that they would increase their spending on other items. So we expect the magnitude in the underspending condition to be smaller. And the result confirms partially to what we hypothesized. So we observe a significant upward trend when people overspend on the focal, and a directional downward trend when people underspend on the focal, although this downward trend is not significant. And again, this is consistent with previous finding that it's difficult for people to report increasing spending, but still we want to try replicating this study and see if the trend is there. So now you're looking at the same graph, but a little zoomed out, and I just wanted to quickly show a conceptual replication. So in the study I just presented, all the participants sorted expenditures before making spending adjustments. And that's part of the feature of the study because we have to get their taxonomy before we can customize their stimuli for them. So now in this new study, we don't do that anymore. So participants in this new study either constructed their taxonomy before or after the spending adjustment task. And they can do that because now we're using, so we're designing this scenarios not from their own taxonomy, but from an aggregate taxonomy that we got from study 1. And again, we could do this because there was statistical consensus that everybody thinks, you know, what is grouped at the bottom should be these items versus others. So yeah, so when we do this, when we use the aggregate taxonomy and randomize the categorization and spending adjustment task, we observe the same pattern with a weak but significant underspending trend as well. And this pattern is similar regardless of whether people do the successive pile sort first or second. Now here, I want to also note that we are giving people comparison products to evaluate. And that's because we're trying to characterize what people do when they're thinking about alternatives and how to adjust their spendings and savings. So having alternative options is a standard shopping context, right? Because when you go into grocery stores, you're always looking at products on the shelf, or you would always be looking at recommended items on Amazon as well. So you'll see that in all of our studies, we ask people, so we give people alternatives and ask people to think about them. So now one concern with our study so far is that whether the taxonomic distance could be simply capturing substitutive relationships. So the idea behind it is like, if two items are substitutes, once you spent on one, you obviously don't need to spend on the other, so you can easily cut that. So we don't think our taxonomic distance construct is the same. So to address that, we collected substitutivity and complementarity ratings and ran a conceptual replication of study 2B. And it's not an exact replication because this time we included a lot more focal items in order to allow large variance in the level of substitutes and complements. So now in this study, in our regressions, we control for substitutivity and complementarity ratings. And we want to see if there's still an effect of taxonomic distance. Now, as the first kind of preliminary finding, we do see that taxonomic distance being negatively correlated to both substitutivity and complementarity. And this echoes our qualitative finding in the very first study. If you still remember, when we saw the dendrogram and things grouped together at the bottom of the dendrogram would include both substitutes and complement. So the taxonomic distance is kind of similar, is close in the way that that people think about substitutes and complements both as very close in taxonomic distance. So it's different, but related to both of these constructs. And as a result, this time you're looking at a similar kind of result graph as before, but I want to show the trend line better, so I'm leaving out the bars. And this is the result before any controls. And slope is marginal on the overspending group, while significant on the underspending group. Now, this is slightly different because we're including a larger set of scenarios in this study. But the highlight here is that once we control for substitute and complement ratings, we can generate the estimated marginal means for spending adjustment at each distance. And we can see that once we control for everything, the effect of taxonomic distance actually gets more prominent. So this suggests in that taxonomic distance captures something above and beyond the cross-product relationships. And the effect actually manifests better once you control for these correlated variables. So this is another way to say it is that the taxonomic distance is different from these substitutes and complements, and it's not captured by these relationships. One last variation on this set of study that I wanted to mention is one that uses incentivized choice as our dependent variable instead of a Likert scale rating. So far we've asked people to rate their spending adjustment, but people might think about the problem differently when they're thinking about, actually choosing or getting the product. So in this study, we designed a buy one, get one free product bundle scenario. So participants read that they purchased either coffee or toilet paper, and they learned that as a promotion, they could get one of the following products, and they're all priced around $15. And the three products are detergents, pizza, or stationery products. And the stationery products kind of served as a control, and they would have to choose between the three. And in the end, we would draw 3 people to realize their choices. Now, the idea behind the study is that if people read about their purchase on coffee, they might want to get pizza for free because that's close in distance to coffee. But if they read about the purchase on toilet paper, they might want to get detergents for free because detergents and toilet paper are closer in distance. In other words, we expect the choice percentage for detergents and pizza to be different based on what they read about. And this is what we found. 55% of people chose detergents when they read about toilet paper, so that's this bar. And then 29% of people chose detergents when they read about coffee. And this pattern reverses on pizza. And there's some complication in that people end up choosing stationary products at a different rate as well, but the overall percentage is pretty small. Now, this finding also does not support the substitutes account because people wouldn't get the substitute for free when they just purchased on the focal product if they think that these 2 items can replace each other. But this would be consistent with our theory that people would try to save on the item that is taxonomically the closest if they just purchased on something. So now, even though we tried to incentivize people's choices in the previous study, one could argue that it is still different from what people do in the real world because there's lottery involved. And so in this last study, we want to investigate what people actually do beyond what their self-reported purchase adjustment is. So we look into people's actual grocery purchases. So in this study, we examined the Nielsen data set, which contains the data set contains over 2 decades of grocery purchase trips, and we choose a recent decade. Now, we look at the question of that once people just spent on some item, how do they adjust their spending on a comparison item in response to the discount on the product of varying distances. And we hypothesize that once consumer spend on some items, so they would be more likely to increase their spending on a comparison item when a close focal is on sale as compared to when a far focal is on sale. And that's because when a close focal is on sale, the connection or the taxonomic distance between the focal and the comparison are more highlighted, and people would want to increase their spending on the comparison item because now they think they have a relief in their budget that they can kind of splurge a little bit as compared to when a far focal is on sale. So to test this, we will be using the following model. So we regress the log of the total price spent on the comparison product onto an indicator variable of whether the focal product is on sale. And obviously controlling for a variety of other variables such as household size, basket size, because we're making inferences from this observed data set. So now here, our variable of interest in this model is the coefficient on the deal indicator. So is this beta. Now, the idea behind it is that if the focal product is on sale, people perceive that they have some budget relief or have some budget left, and that they can splurge, so they can spend more on the comparison item. So there would be a positive coefficient. So if the focal is on deal, people would spend more on the comparison. So beta should be positive. And if the focal variable, if the focal like purchase item is taxonomically close to the comparison item, then this coefficient should be larger. And as an example, right, we chose the close and far items using the taxonomy that we had before. But as an example, the comparison product could be your price spent on detergents, and we expected that when you just or when the toilet paper you just had is on sale, then you would end up purchasing more detergents than when the coffee you just purchased is on sale. So the close focal here is toilet paper, and then far focal would be coffee, and the comparison would be detergents. So here's the result. You'll see a forest plot with each dot representing the coefficient on our variable of interest. So you'll see two coefficients for every year, one on the close item and one on the far item. And we expect that the coefficient for the close focal, right, which is the dark red dot, to be more on the right than the coefficient for the far item. And this is what we observe. This pattern holds almost for every year. And it indicates that people adjust more when they just saved on a close distance item than a far distance item. And the other thing to point out here is that, you know, all of these coefficients are positive, which means that when people just saved on something, they would try to spend more on something else within this grocery trip. So that's all of our studies. To summarize, we propose that consumers' budgeting behavior depends on their represented taxonomy. And specifically, when a consumer spends more on an item and the spending deviates from the budget, she's more likely to adjust on a taxonomically close item as opposed to a far item. And now we want to highlight some contributions in the end. And this way of thinking gives us a broader kind of framework to think about budgeting and spending behavior, because now we can make predictions on various pairs of expenditures beyond the categorical boundary. And this adjustment is spontaneous and free of categorical restrictions. So we don't need to label the categories for consumer. They only need to look at the alternative and the items to know how to adjust and how much to adjust. Now, further, you know, we also introduced this online successive pile sort tool to have people recover the representation of expenditures. And this tool, originally borrowed from cognitive science, can be further applied to study demand relationships or brand relationships or generating perceptual maps, to use this tool in a lot of ways that would help us understand what consumers are thinking. And so with that, we'll conclude, and thank you all for your attention. And please let us know if you have any questions.
That was great. Thank you so much. So everyone in the audience, feel free to use that Q&A feature to ask any questions. And I'll kick us off with just a couple of things that came to mind while you're presenting. So assuming I followed you right, you're representing distance taxonomically, essentially how high up the ladder do you have to go? You could also imagine there's probably some lateral distance as well, right? So the category of frozen food might be conceptually closer to the category of gourmet food than the category of personal care products. Have you thought about representing that sort of horizontal or cluster distance and how that might affect your results?
Didn't realize I muted myself. I don't know if I can like share my screen again to kind of show you some things that didn't make it to the main slideshow. But so the first thing that we did in study one is to represent it in the in the cluster distance, so without kind of assumptions of the levels of category. And we've run most of our models with different calculations of distance. So there's one distance that's generated from our participants, and that's the levels of distance. And we can get a different form of distance with this multidimensional scaling. So this would be the horizontal kind of lateral distance that you were talking about. We ran our models with all of these distances as kind of a robustness check. And it would turn out that these distance, no matter how you calculate it, would matter. We've also like rank transformed, we've used the hierarchical clustering distances. And so everything that we could thought of is, yeah, we tried them and checked with the distance. So, and in this project, we're not kind of deferring, you know, how different ways to calculate distance, but we just want to highlight that the distance really matters. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. We have a question from the audience, from Dilip. So he's asking, for folks that help people budget or develop budgeting tools, what would you say are the key implications of your work?
I think there are multiple things that would be super helpful for people who are designing or thinking about how other people could be budgeting. First of all is to understand like what is the level that people are budgeting on. So with that, let me actually stop sharing. Okay. Yeah, so it's to understand what levels people are budgeting at. And so with our practice, you can give them their common expenditures that they encountered during the day and have them kind of sort them and think about, you know, what are the natural level of categories that people construct, and then give them the natural categorical labels. That's one way. And the other implication that is important is that like in our study, and it turned out that we're really lucky to have this level of consensus across our participants in the way that they budget and think about their expenditures. But for practitioners, it might be really important to look into the heterogeneity or the individual differences across the people or their users, to highlight, you know, what there could be one way of generating these budgeting categories that's important for one group versus another. And so this is some differences that practitioners should be paying attention to. I don't know if Dan has any additional input.
No, I think that's great. Yep.
Yeah, super interesting. So some of us are kind of wondering that it's amazing that you have this generality and consistency across people, but it seems like you could also have some interesting heterogeneity. So individual differences in maybe how people represent those categories or the extent to which they substitute. So Tim asked a question of whether in your data you run any controls for income and see if people who are higher income maybe are less likely to adjust overall, or do they show different types of behavior?
Right. So we did run income, and it's in the appendix of this slide. Yeah, so income, so here what we find is essentially that, you know, when you have higher income, we didn't include it as kind of an interaction term, but the income in of itself, like when you have higher income, you're more likely to engage in the spending adjustment behavior. So like you're more sensitive to kind of the spending deviations, or the other way to put it is that you're paying more attention to your budget, which is consistent with what previous findings have found. Yeah, but one way is to separate kind of the product categorization with income, with payment frequency is one way to think about it as well, because their budgeting period is likely to be different. And sometimes, you know, different, if we choose the right set of items, and Dan and I were talking about this, but if we choose the right set of items, we think that, you know, maybe gender or knowledge or experience might show different ways of categorizing and generating the hierarchy of the items as well. So, but this is something that we're kind of not looking into with the scope of this project. Yeah, so there's definitely individual heterogeneity. Oh, there's one thing that we can say is that, you know, the level that people initially construct is vastly different. The consensus that we obtain is just like the whole hierarchy, which ones are closer is consistent across participants. But some people might start from the frozen food level and other people might start from the grocery level. And that would be different.
Yeah, you can imagine maybe people of different income levels have different depths of representation. So maybe if you have more experience or exposure or knowledge, you have like deeper representations with more branches or something that could be interesting to explore.
Well, one thing to just quick to Tim's question. Tim predicted the opposite relationship to the one that that we find, right? So there has been other work that finds that participation in budgeting behavior is correlated with having good financial health. Lynn mentioned that earlier in the talk. Tim's prediction was that people who have a lot of money wouldn't adjust because they just have so much money, right? They just have so much liquidity or whatever. It's worth saying that I think the finding that Lynn has, you have to think about the population of people that we're working with, right? So these are prolific panelists. They're people who are panelists on in this panel called prolific. And so they're doing okay, but there aren't very many Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates types in that panel. So there might be sort of a restriction of range effect where we don't have many, really ultra wealthy people who don't care about budgets because they don't have to. Sorry.
Yeah, that's a great point. So do you have any intentions to try to capture those higher income people or see if they have different beliefs?
If anybody in the audience knows how to get us into touch with with those.
Philip, I know you're there. Anyone else in the audience, help them out. Yeah, no, I think that's a really cool question. So we have another question from Yan Yi. If you have a sense, maybe this is some practical insight, what product or product category tends to be affected the most in people's expenditures when costs go up?
When costs of like in general, like we're talking about inflation.
I think they're asking potentially what is maybe the most sensitive, or what kind of substitution do you see most strongly?
So this is an interesting kind of story that we had, and we had many attempts to get people to report what they would spontaneously adjust when they, when in cases of inflation, in cases of cost change, and the one thing that they go that every condition that they turn to is dining out. So when we get people to say, what they would like to adjust, they kind of result to something that's easy to adjust, that they want to control, and these kind of things dominate their thinking, which is why in our studies we always present people with alternatives, because we want them to think about the distances. Because otherwise, people just say, hey, we all can save on dining out, and so let's do that. And so this is the one thing that people think about if you give them, all the options in the world. But if you restrict them in a spending environment, which is often what they find themselves in, then it would be different. It depends on the expenditures that are available and what they would be thinking.
Great. So we have a question from Michael about how to conceptualize your work in the language of economics. So Michael asked if it would be fair to characterize your framework in the following 2 steps. So first, you empirically investigate which goods are substitutes, that is nearby categories, and then you analyze whether the cross-spending elasticity is negative. So essentially you reduce spending on 2 goods that are substitutes. Is that a fair characterization?
I think this is, to an extent, what we want to try kind of argue against in a way. So we don't think so. Like the conceptualization of substitute is kind of narrowly defined in the way. So substitutes, if you think about it as in the fashion of like satiation, for example, right? So like if you bought one thing, it fulfills your need for the other thing, and you don't have to buy this other thing anymore. And if that's the definition of substitute, that is not what we're finding, because what we're finding is that one item is closely associated with the other, but the other thing So if you think about, okay, peanut butter and jelly, and they're what's often believed to complements, or butter and bread, right? What's often believed to complements even could be taxonomically like closely associated in people's minds, and we would actually predict in the, in light of budget deviations, if you deviate on bread, you would adjust on peanut butter, and vice versa as well. So like empirically, it would show something as it's actually positive cross product elasticity, I think, but in that you would actually show something that show the cross product relationship that's believed to be substitutes, but in a concept framework, they're actually complements, but only because that you just spent on one thing with budgeting deviation, and you're trying to adjust on things that come the most readily to your mind, that they get adjusted in that way. So in that way, no, we're not trying to characterize what are substitutes. Yeah, Dan, I don't know if
no, that's right. And I think the studies where we measure substitutability or whatever it's called, and complementarity. So two things can be close together in your mind because they're complements or substitutes. And so that was the purpose of really drilling down on that with some of the later lab studies, was to see, okay, if we characterize these things in those terms, which could be confounding variables, because either set of relations could cause you to think of one when you think of the other. What do we observe? And it looks like these patterns that relate to taxonomic distances are not explained in terms of, they don't amount to like some simple combination of substitutability and complementarity.
Super interesting, thank you. So we also have a comment and question from Derek. So it seems like in most of your studies, you are making it explicit that people have sort of surpassed their budget or under a particular budget as a fixed thing. So this is the budget. Do you think there might be flexibility in how people choose to categorize, maybe in ways that allow them to say they haven't actually overspent on a particular category?
I think that's super interesting, but it's not something, it's something kind of here and trying to make it obvious to our participants their spending relationship with respect to the budget. And if anything, I think the last study is kind of mute in that respect, in that, we're only picking out if a focal product is on sale, and assuming that if a focal product is on sale, people experience kind of the budget relief. And so that's, and in the promotion study, right, we say something comes with a buy one get one free promotion, and with all of these kind of promotion and discounts and sale context, we assume that people are thinking about a budget relief. And so that's one way for us to kind of generalize what might get people to think about their budgeting deviation without telling them, hey, you deviated from your budget. Right, but I there definitely has multiple, there would be multiple ways to think about that, but this is the one way that we went about it. It would be interesting to think about when do people think that they are deviating from their budget, and when do people think that they're not? Yeah.
And just to one more thing. First of all, hi, Derek. And that intuition that Kristen expressed is consistent with an intuition in this paper that another person on this call, Dilip Soman and Amar Chima, have a paper where they basically find that for certain kinds of things, if you can assign it to one category or another, you might choose to think of spending as belonging in one category versus another, so you feel like you haven't overspent. One of the neat things about Lynn's dendrogram is it gives you a sense of how well these things fit in a category. And so researchers have identified certain things like going out to eat, that could be food or that could be entertainment. And you might, express some sort of flexibility in how you categorize that to make you feel good or to make you feel good about your spending. So one of the things that's kind of neat about Lynn's approach to doing this is that you can identify things that are sort of on the boundary between two categories. You can identify those kinds of things that might be most malleable, or you might be able to identify things that are a category member, but are kind of atypical and potentially exceptional. And as Derek knows, there's a whole literature and categories and concepts on how people think about really weird, atypical category members. So there's a lot left to do. Yeah.
Super interesting. And I guess on the point of flexibility, do you have a sense that this is something that marketers are shaping when they, for example, figure out an assortment style in a grocery store? So do you think there's any way of potentially recovering people's typical environments that they interact in and how that might translate into their representations?
Completely. So we think that the representation that people constructed, at least for some, and if not majority of the items in the representation, there are ways to kind of change people's so like, for example, I go to Trader Joe's and they usually put liquor with wine, and then recently, I think it's after pandemic, they put like wine together into the cheese category. And I was thinking to myself, this is teaching people how to pair, obviously, but also like changing your representation of like when you're consuming this and where could you get this product. And so in ways where grocery stores and marketers are trying to think about putting or changing something and ways to place their product, that's one way to think about how things would get or the representation could get changed. And on top of that, like apart from environmental kind of changes, there are products that are more, as Dan was saying, there are products that are more malleable than others. Some products are already, if you look at the cluster, are already kind of at the boundary of two big clusters. And in which case, you can think about, for example, gym membership, I think was one of them. It is kind of like an entertainment spending, but it's also like a bill. So when you have those like subscription things kind of in the middle, and you can shape to an extent how people are thinking about them. So there are items that are like that. Environments are constantly trying to do that. And yeah, it will be good to see, if there are kind of systematic ways that you can change people's representation of a certain group of items.
That's fantastic. Super interesting. Well, we're all hooked in to see what else you find next. We would like to thank Lynn and Dan again for leading our fantastic webinar today. A full recording of this webinar will be available on our website by clicking the side tab labeled Events and then clicking the sub tab labeled Bear Webinar Series. So this is our last webinar session for the academic year. So we would like to thank all of you for tuning in and following this series and for attending this excellent talk. Enjoy the rest of your afternoons.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.